In the heart of Europe, there once stood a city that had known both triumph and tragedy. Berlin, a place of broad avenues and quiet neighborhoods, of grand buildings and modest homes, had weathered storms that tested the very spirit of humanity. And in the summer of 1961, as warm breezes carried the scent of linden trees through its streets, the city faced a transformation that would mark it forever. Picture, if you will, a summer night in August. The stars hung softly in the sky, as they had for countless generations. Families slept peacefully in their beds, dreaming of ordinary tomorrows. Children clutched their favorite toys. Mothers and fathers rested beside one another, and the city breathed in and out like a sleeping giant, unaware of what dawn would bring. But in the darkness, as the clock moved toward the 13th of August, something was stirring. Trucks rolled quietly through empty streets. Soldiers moved with purpose through the shadows. And when the people of Berlin opened their eyes to greet the morning, they found their world had changed overnight. Where once there had been open streets connecting neighborhood to neighborhood, friend to friend, now there was wire. Barbed and cruel, it cut through the city like a scar across a beloved face. Families who had lived on the same street for generations suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a divide they had never imagined possible. A mother stood at a window, looking across at the building where her own mother lived, just 50 meters away. She could see the curtains in the window, could imagine the kettle boiling for morning tea, but she could no longer reach out and touch the hands that had held her as a child. The distance was no more than the length of a city block, but it had become as vast as an ocean. On one side of the wire, a father prepared for work at a factory he could now see but no longer reach. His tools remained there, his workbench, the photographs of his children he had pinned beside his station. All of it lay just beyond an invisible line that had been drawn while he slept. And yet, life continued, as life always does. People adapted, as humans have always adapted, finding ways to carry on even when the world feels too heavy to bear. They waved to one another across the divide. They held up signs in windows, sending messages of love and hope across the wire. They found in their shared sorrow a common bond that even barriers could not fully sever. The wire, in time, would become a wall. Concrete blocks stacked one upon another, gray and cold and unyielding. Guard towers rose at intervals, their searchlights sweeping back and forth through the night like the eyes of some sleepless giant. The wall grew taller, thicker, more formidable with each passing season. They called the space between the two walls the death strip, though we shall speak of it more gently here. It was a place of sand and silence, of tripwires and watchtowers, where grass struggled to grow and birds rarely landed. It stretched for miles, encircling the western half of the city like a hand closing around a heart. But even walls cannot contain the human spirit. Even in the shadow of concrete and wire, people found ways to live, to love, to hope. Children grew up knowing no other reality, yet dreaming of a different one. Lovers whispered plans in quiet corners. Families held fast to the belief that someday, somehow, they would be together again. On one side of the wall, a grandmother kept a room prepared for grandchildren she could not hold. She dusted the toys she had saved from her own children's youth, changed the sheets on the bed each season, kept fresh flowers by the window. For when they come, she would say to anyone who listened, for when they finally come. On the other side, those same grandchildren learned their grandmother's face from faded photographs, heard her voice in stories told by parents who ached with the absence. They drew pictures to send across the divide, childish sketches of houses with gardens and families holding hands. Sometimes these pictures arrived. Sometimes they did not. But always, they were drawn with hope. The wall stood for 28 years, 28 cycles of spring blossoms and autumn leaves. 28 times the snow fell soft and white on both sides of the barrier, caring nothing for the divisions humans had made. 28 years of birthdays celebrated in separation, of holidays marked by absence, of lives lived in parallel but apart. And in those years, the wall became more than concrete and wire. It became a symbol of division, of fear, of the walls we build not just between nations but between hearts. It stood as a reminder of humanity's capacity to separate itself, to draw lines and declare some people in and others out, some free and others trapped. But symbols, like walls, can fall. And the story of how this one came down is a story of patience and persistence, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of hope that refused to be silenced, no matter how thick the concrete grew. As you settle into comfort this evening, let your breathing slow and steady. Feel the weight of your body supported beneath you. Know that even the tallest walls eventually crumble, that even the longest nights eventually yield to dawn. The story of the Berlin Wall is, ultimately, a story of reunion and redemption, of barriers broken and bridges built. And it begins, as all great changes begin, with ordinary people refusing to accept that the world cannot be different, cannot be better, cannot be made whole again. Time moves differently when you are separated from those you love. Days can feel like weeks, weeks like months, months like years. And for the people of divided Berlin, time took on a quality both heavy and strange, as if they were living in two different worlds that occupied the same space. In the East, life settled into a rhythm dictated by the state. People woke to the same radio programs, read the same newspapers, heard the same messages about building a better future. There were jobs and schools, theaters and parks, the ordinary machinery of daily life. But always, there was the awareness of the wall, the knowledge that beyond it lay a different reality, a different way of being. Children born after the wall went up knew no other Berlin. To them, the barrier was simply part of the landscape, like a river or a mountain range. They played in its shadow, rode their bicycles along streets that ended abruptly at checkpoint gates. Some of them wondered what lay beyond. Others accepted it without question. Both were equally real, equally valid ways of making sense of a divided world. A young girl named Anna grew up in an apartment building that faced the wall. From her bedroom window, she could see the guard tower, could watch the soldiers pacing back and forth with their rifles and their binoculars. At night, the searchlights would sweep across her ceiling, painting moving patterns that she learned to find comforting, like a strange, mechanical lullaby. Her grandmother told her stories of before, of when you could walk from one end of Berlin to the other without stopping, when the city was whole and families were together. But to Anna, these stories felt like fairy tales, like something from a storybook rather than real memory. She could not imagine a Berlin without the wall. It was as essential to her understanding of the world as the sky above or the ground beneath her feet. In the West, life continued with its own particular character. The city became an island of capitalism surrounded by a socialist sea, a place both isolated and connected, trapped and free. People could leave, could fly out to other parts of West Germany, could travel the world. But they could not simply walk next door, could not visit the neighborhoods where their parents had grown up, could not tend the graves of their ancestors. An old man named Klaus kept a shop near the wall. He sold newspapers and cigarettes, candy for children, and lottery tickets for dreamers. Every morning he unlocked his door and swept his stoop, and every morning he looked toward the barrier that had stolen half his city. His wife was buried on the other side, in a cemetery he could no longer reach. Sometimes he would stand at the wall and press his palm against the cold concrete, imagining he could feel her presence through the stone. But life, as it must, went on. People fell in love and married, had children and grandchildren. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, mourned losses, and celebrated victories. They found joy in small things, as humans always do, even in difficult circumstances. A warm day in spring, a good meal shared with friends, the laughter of a child, music drifting from an open window, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. In the wider world beyond Berlin, beyond Germany, the structures that had created the division were themselves beginning to shift. The Soviet Union, that vast empire that had seemed so permanent, so immovable, was showing signs of strain. Economic problems mounted, discontent grew, and a new leader had emerged, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, who spoke of reform and openness, of restructuring and new thinking. In Poland, workers had formed a union called Solidarity, and their courage in standing up to authority inspired others across Eastern Europe. In Hungary, the government began to loosen restrictions, to open borders, to allow more freedom of movement. These changes rippled outward like stones thrown into a still pond, creating waves that would eventually reach every shore. In East Germany, people began to gather, at first in small groups, then in larger ones. They met in churches, those ancient spaces of sanctuary and hope, and they spoke of change. They spoke quietly at first, cautiously, aware of the risks. The state had eyes and ears everywhere, and dissent could be dangerous. But the gatherings continued, grew, became something that could not be easily dismissed. Every Monday evening in Leipzig, a city south of Berlin, people would come together for prayers and peaceful protest. They called them the Monday demonstrations, and they were remarkable for their gentleness, their refusal to meet force with force. They carried candles instead of weapons, sang hymns instead of revolutionary anthems. And week by week, more people came. What began with a few hundred grew to thousands, then tens of thousands. They walked through the streets with their candles flickering in the darkness, a river of light flowing through the night. "We are the people," they chanted. Simple words, but powerful ones. A reminder that governments derive their power from the governed, that walls are built by human hands and can be torn down by them as well. The state watched nervously. In China, earlier that year, a similar movement had ended in tragedy, with tanks rolling into Tiananmen Square and crushing the protests with violent force. Many feared the same would happen in East Germany, that the government would respond with troops and weapons. that blood would run in the streets of Leipzig and Berlin. But it did not happen. The soldiers stood down, the tanks remained in their barracks, and the Monday demonstrations continued week after week, their numbers swelling with each passing Monday. In Berlin, people began to feel something they had not felt in years: possibility. The air itself seemed charged with it, electric with anticipation. Something was shifting, something fundamental was changing, though no one could quite say what or when or how. Young people especially began to feel restless. They had grown up with the wall, had never known a divided city, and yet they sensed that the world their parents had accepted as permanent might not be so permanent after all. They gathered in cafes and apartments, talking late into the night about freedom and change, about dreams that had seemed impossible just months before. An artist named Stefan began painting on the western side of the wall. He created enormous murals, bright and defiant, claiming the gray concrete as a canvas for hope and imagination. Other artists joined him, and soon sections of the wall were covered in color, in images that spoke of freedom and unity, of a world beyond barriers. The wall was still standing, still guarded, still impassable, but it was beginning to lose its power, its ability to define what was possible. People on both sides began to believe, carefully at first, and then with growing confidence, that change might actually come. And then, in the autumn of 1989, events began to accelerate. Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating a gap in the Iron Curtain for the first time. East Germans began traveling to Hungary ostensibly for vacation, then fleeing through that opening to the west. Thousands left, then tens of thousands. The trickle became a flood. The East German government tried to stem the tide, tried to maintain control, but it was like trying to hold back the sea with your hands. People wanted freedom. People wanted reunification. People wanted to live in one Berlin, not two. And so the government fell, as governments sometimes do, not with violence, but with a kind of exhausted surrender. Leaders who had seemed immovable stepped down. New voices emerged. And in the confusion and hope and uncertainty of those autumn days, a press conference was scheduled for the evening of November 9th. It was supposed to be routine, just another bureaucratic announcement of new travel regulations. But nothing about that night would prove routine. Nothing about that night would be ordinary. For on that November evening, as winter approached and darkness fell early, a spokesman named Günter Schabowski would say words that would change everything, words that would send thousands of people flooding toward the wall, toward the checkpoints, toward freedom. But that comes next, in the telling of this story. For now, rest in the knowledge that change was coming, that hope was rising, that the wall's days were numbered, even if no one yet knew exactly when or how it would fall. Breathe deeply. Let your shoulders relax. Feel the tension leaving your body like water draining away. The world was changing, is always changing, moving towards something better even when we cannot see it clearly. Tomorrow holds possibilities we cannot imagine tonight. And in Berlin, in the autumn of 1989, tomorrow was arriving faster than anyone expected. November 9th began like any other Thursday in Berlin. People woke to gray skies and cold air, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay inside with a warm drink and a good book. They went about their morning routines, unaware that by nightfall their world would be transformed. In East Berlin, officials prepared for a press conference scheduled for that evening. It was meant to announce new travel regulations, a loosening of restrictions on East Germans wanting to visit the West. The rules were complex, full of qualifications and requirements, the kind of bureaucratic language that governments use when they want to appear to be making changes without actually changing very much. But among the papers prepared for the press conference was a note about when these new regulations would take effect. The answer, according to the documents, was immediately. But this was meant to be explained with nuance, with caveats, with the understanding that immediately in government language rarely means what ordinary people think it means. Günter Schabowski was the spokesman chosen to announce these new policies. He was not a particularly notable figure in the government, not someone whose name people would recognize on the street. He was a functionary, a bureaucrat, someone who had risen through the party ranks by being reliable and unremarkable. As afternoon faded toward evening, Schabowski reviewed his notes for the press conference. But he had not been involved in drafting the policy, had not been part of the discussions about implementation. He was simply reading from prepared statements, answering questions as best he could with the information he had been given. Meanwhile, across the city, people were going about their evening activities. Families gathered for dinner. Students studied for exams. Workers returned home, tired from their shifts. The wall stood as it had stood for 28 years, solid and seemingly permanent, a fact of life so constant it had become almost invisible through its very ubiquity. At 6 o'clock, the press conference began. Reporters filled the room, notebooks ready, cameras rolling. Schabowski read through various announcements, most of them dry and technical. The reporters listened with varying degrees of attention, some taking notes, others letting their minds wander. Then came the announcement about the travel regulations. Schabowski explained the new policy, such as it was. East Germans would be allowed to travel to the West under certain conditions. There would be procedures, applications, approvals. It was all very orderly, very controlled, very much in keeping with how the government had always operated. Then a reporter asked a simple question. When would this new policy take effect? Schabowski shuffled through his papers, looking for the answer. His colleagues had not briefed him properly on this detail. He found the note that said immediately, and, assuming this meant what it said, he repeated it to the reporters. Immediately, without delay. The words hung in the air for a moment. The reporters looked at each other, uncertain if they had heard correctly. Immediately, without delay. This was unprecedented. This was revolutionary. This changed everything. The press conference continued for a few more minutes, but the journalists were no longer fully present. They were already thinking about their next moves, about how to report this news, about what it might mean. As soon as the conference ended, they rushed to their phones, their typewriters, their television cameras. In West Berlin, people watched the news on television. They heard Schabowski's words, heard the confusion and excitement in the reporters' voices. And slowly, they began to understand. The border was opening. The wall was coming down. Freedom was at hand. In East Berlin, the news spread more slowly, but just as powerfully. People called each other on the telephone, sharing what they had heard. They gathered in small groups on street corners, debating whether the news could be true. Most had West German television and could watch the reports themselves, seeing the press conference replayed over and over, hearing Schabowski's words echo through the evening, immediately, without delay. And then, without any organization or coordination, people began to move toward the wall. At first just a few, then dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. They came from apartments and offices, from restaurants and bars, from quiet homes and busy streets. They came on foot and by bicycle, on trams and by car. They converged on the checkpoints, those heavily guarded crossing points that had been closed for so long. At the Bornholmerstrasse checkpoint, a crowd began to gather. People pressed against the barriers, asking to be let through. The guards, confused and uncertain, called their superiors for instructions. But no clear orders came. The chain of command was breaking down, dissolved by the weight of history moving faster than bureaucracy could respond. The crowd grew larger. Hundreds became thousands. People chanted and sang, their voices rising into the cold November night. They were not angry, not violent. They were hopeful, excited, disbelieving that this moment they had dreamed of for so long might actually be arriving. Inside the checkpoint building, Harold Jaeger, the commander on duty that night, faced an impossible situation. He had thousands of people outside demanding to cross. He had standing orders to maintain border security. He had no clear instructions from his superiors about what to do in this unprecedented situation. The crowd pressed closer. The guards, vastly outnumbered, stood uncertain. Jaeger made calls, trying to reach someone who could tell him what to do. But the government was in chaos, the leadership paralyzed by the speed of events. No one wanted to give the order to open the gates. But equally, no one wanted to give the order to use force against peaceful citizens. Time stretched and compressed in strange ways. Minutes felt like hours. The crowd continued to grow, to press forward, to demand passage. And finally, at 10:45 in the evening, Harold Jaeger made a decision. He could not hold back the tide any longer. He ordered the gates opened. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if everyone needed to verify that they had heard correctly, that this was really happening. Then, slowly at first, and then in a rush, people began to cross. They walked through the checkpoint gates they had never expected to pass through, their steps uncertain, disbelieving. As word spread that Bornholmerstrasse was open, people rushed to other checkpoints. The guards there, seeing what was happening elsewhere, began opening their gates as well. All across Berlin, the barriers that had divided the city for nearly 3 decades were giving way. In West Berlin, crowds gathered on the other side of the checkpoints, waiting to greet the arrivals. They brought flowers and champagne, chocolate and tears. They embraced strangers, welcoming them to the West with a joy that transcended words. People climbed on top of the wall itself, something that would have been unthinkable just hours before. They danced and sang on that concrete barrier that had loomed so large in their lives. Young people from both sides met on top of the wall, embracing, laughing, crying, celebrating together. The night filled with the sound of hammers and chisels as people began to attack the wall itself. They wanted souvenirs, pieces of history to prove this was real, that this incredible night had actually happened. They chipped away at the concrete with whatever tools they could find, and the wall That seemingly immovable barrier began to crumble under their determination. Anna, the young girl who had grown up in the shadow of the wall, stood with her family in the crowd. Her grandmother, who had kept a room ready for decades, held her hand tightly. They had relatives in the West they had never met, cousins and aunts and uncles who were names in letters and voices on rare phone calls, but never living, breathing presence. "Can we really go?" Anna asked her mother, her voice small and uncertain. Her mother, tears streaming down her face, could only nod. They were going. They were actually going. Klaus, the old shopkeeper who had stood by the wall every morning for years, made his way to the cemetery in the east. He walked through streets he remembered from his youth, past buildings that looked familiar and strange at once. He found his wife's grave and knelt beside it, placing his hand on the cold stone. "The wall is coming down," he whispered. "It's finally coming down." All through that long night, people crossed back and forth, exploring the parts of their city they had been forbidden to enter. They visited old neighborhoods, found former homes, stood in places they had only remembered. They met family members they had not seen in decades, held grandchildren who had been born on the other side of the divide. And everywhere there was celebration. Strangers embraced in the streets. Music played from open windows. People danced and sang, their voices joining together in songs of freedom and joy. The champagne flowed freely, shared among thousands who had never met, but who recognized each other as fellow travelers on this incredible journey. The authorities, both east and west, watched in amazement. No one had planned this. No one had coordinated it. It was simply happening, a spontaneous outpouring of human joy and determination. The people had decided that the wall would come down, and down it came. As dawn approached, people were exhausted but exhilarated. Many had been awake all night, crossing and recrossing the border, exploring and celebrating. The city was transformed, not just physically, but spiritually. The barrier that had defined Berlin for so long was crumbling, and with it crumbled the fear and separation that had poisoned so many years. Some people returned to their homes in the east, ready to sleep after the extraordinary night. Others stayed in the west, marveling at the shops and cafes, at the different quality of the light, at the strange freedom of moving without restriction. All of them carried the memory of this night, this impossible, miraculous night when the wall began to fall. Let your eyes grow heavy now, imagining the exhaustion and joy of those people. Feel the release of tension that had been building for decades. Know that sometimes change comes not gradually, but all at once, like a dam breaking, like spring arriving after a long winter. Rest now in the knowledge that barriers can be overcome, that walls can fall, that reunion and redemption are always possible. When morning came on November 10th, Berlin woke to a new reality. The sun rose on a city transformed, not yet by any physical change, but by a fundamental shift in what was possible, what was permitted, what was real. People emerged from their homes uncertain if the previous night had been a dream, but the evidence was everywhere. The checkpoints stood open. People moved freely back and forth across the border. The wall remained standing, but it had lost its power overnight, become nothing more than concrete and wire, rather than an absolute division between worlds. In those first days, there was a sense of unreality, of disbelief. People kept expecting someone to say it had all been a mistake, that the borders would close again, that the old rules would reassert themselves. But the hours passed, and then days, and the opening remained. The wall was still there, but it no longer divided. Families began the work of reunion. Brothers and sisters separated for decades met again, older now, changed by time, but still recognizably themselves. They stood looking at each other, taking in gray hair and wrinkles, the visible markers of all the years lived in separation. They embraced awkwardly at first, then more firmly, making up for decades of absent embraces. Anna's grandmother finally met her granddaughter in person rather than through photographs and letters. She held the girl's face in her hands, memorizing every detail, making up for all the birthdays missed, all the ordinary moments that had been stolen by the wall. She had imagined this reunion so many times, had played it out in her mind in countless variations. But the reality was both simpler and more profound than any fantasy. It was real. It was happening. Her granddaughter was here. "You're taller than I expected," she said, laughing through tears. It was such an ordinary observation, the kind of thing grandmothers always say. But in that ordinariness lay something precious, the reclaiming of normal family relationships that the wall had stolen. Everywhere, similar scenes played out. Cousins met for the first time. Elderly parents saw their middle-aged children, marveling at how they had changed. Friends reunited, picking up conversations that had been interrupted decades before. Some relationships rekindled easily, slipping back into old patterns. Others struggled, finding that too much time had passed, that they had become different people in their years of separation. But all of them, every single one, was grateful for the chance to try. The wall itself became a canvas for joy and anger, hope and relief. People covered it with graffiti, messages of celebration and remembrance. Artists created elaborate murals. Children drew pictures and wrote their names. The gray concrete disappeared beneath layers of color and words, transformed from a symbol of division into a testament of human resilience. And people continued to attack it physically, chipping away pieces to keep as souvenirs. They called themselves wallpeckers, these people with their hammers and chisels and sheer determination. Chunk by chunk, piece by piece, they reduced the barrier to rubble. It would take more than a year for the wall to be completely demolished. But in those early days, the work began in earnest. The East German government, such as it remained, announced official crossing points. The historic Brandenburg Gate, that symbol of Berlin that had stood inaccessible behind the wall for so long, was opened on December 22nd. Crowds gathered to watch as bulldozers cleared the barriers, creating a passage through the wall at this most symbolic of locations. People streamed through the Brandenburg Gate, a river of humanity flowing in both directions. They stood beneath its columns and arches, taking photographs, embracing, celebrating. The gate had witnessed so much of German history, had seen triumph and tragedy, war and peace. Now it witnessed reunion, the coming together of a city and a people that had been divided against their will. East Berliners explored the West with a mixture of wonder and disappointment. Some were amazed by the abundance of goods in the shops, by the variety of choices available. Others were overwhelmed, even disturbed, by the commercialism, the advertising, the relentless emphasis on consumption. The West was not the paradise some had imagined, but neither was it the corrupt wasteland they had been told it was. It was simply different, another way of organizing society with its own strengths and weaknesses. West Berliners, in turn, visited the East. They saw the neighborhoods where their parents and grandparents had lived, now aged and worn from years of minimal maintenance. They visited historical sites and museums, parks and cafes. Some found the East charming in its old-fashioned quality, untouched by the rapid development of the West. Others saw poverty and decay, evidence of a system that had not served its people well. But beyond judgments and comparisons, there was simple curiosity. People wanted to see the other half of their city, to understand the lives that had been lived on the other side of the wall. They wanted to make Berlin whole again in their own minds, to stitch together the divided parts into a complete picture. The question of reunification began to be discussed seriously. For decades, it had been a distant dream, something people spoke of but did not really expect to see in their lifetimes. But now, with the wall opened and the East German government crumbling, reunification seemed not just possible, but inevitable. There were practical concerns, of course. The East German economy was in shambles, its infrastructure aging and inadequate. Combining the two halves of Germany would be expensive, complicated, fraught with difficulties. But the emotional and symbolic pull was powerful. People wanted one Germany again, wanted to heal the division that had scarred the nation for so long. In other parts of Eastern Europe, similar transformations were underway. The opening of the Berlin Wall had been like a signal, a demonstration that change was possible. In Czechoslovakia, in Romania, in Bulgaria, people took to the streets demanding freedom and reform. The Soviet Empire that had seemed so permanent, so immovable, was dissolving like morning mist under the sun. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader whose policies of openness and reform had helped create the conditions for change, watched these events with mixed emotions. He had wanted reform, had genuinely believed that the Soviet system could be improved and modernized. But events had moved beyond his control, had taken on a momentum of their own. And he did something remarkable. He let it happen. There were no tanks sent to restore order, no troops deployed to crush the democratic movements. The Soviet Union, for all its military might, simply stepped back and allowed Eastern Europe to choose its own path. It was an act of historical consequence, a decision not to use force when force had always been the answer before. In Berlin, life began to normalize in ways that would have been unimaginable just weeks before. People went to work in one half of the city and shopped in the other. They visited friends and family freely, without checkpoints or papers or permissions. The physical wall remained, but the psychological wall, the barrier in hearts and minds, was already falling. Young people especially embraced the new reality with enthusiasm. They had never known the undivided city, had grown up assuming the wall was permanent. Now they explored both halves of Berlin with the excitement of discoverers, finding cafes and clubs, music and art, forming friendships that crossed the old divide. Stefan, the artist who had painted on the western side of the wall, now worked on murals in the east. He collaborated with artists from both sides, creating works that celebrated unity and hope. One of his pieces showed hands reaching toward each other across a gap, fingers almost touching, the space between them dissolving into color and light. The winter of 1989 was cold in Berlin, but people seemed not to notice. They were warmed by possibility, by the extraordinary changes happening all around them. Snow fell on both sides of the wall, and children from east and west played together in it, building snowmen and having snowball fights, oblivious to the divisions that had seemed so absolute to their parents. As the year drew to a close, people looked back on 1989 with astonishment. So much had changed, and so quickly. The wall had seemed eternal, the division of Germany a fixed fact of the post-war world. But in the end, it had taken only one confused press conference, one night of people power, one commander's decision to open the gates, and everything had transformed. There was work ahead, difficult work. Reunification would not be simple or easy. There would be challenges, disagreements, difficult adjustments. But as the new year approached, people allowed themselves to hope, to believe that the future might be better than the past. Breathe slowly and steadily. Feel yourself settling deeper into rest. Know that change, when it comes, can come faster than we imagine. That decades of division can be healed. That walls, no matter how solid they seem, are ultimately temporary structures in the face of human determination. Rest now, knowing that the story continues toward reunion and healing. As winter deepened and 1990 arrived, the practical work of reunification began. The emotional celebration of the wall's opening had been powerful and necessary. But now came the harder task of actually joining two systems that had evolved separately for more than 4 decades. The economics alone were staggering. East Germany's economy was revealed to be far weaker than even pessimists had predicted. Factories were outdated, infrastructure was crumbling, productivity was low, the currency was nearly worthless. Joining the East German economy with the much more prosperous West would be like trying to merge a small, struggling company with a major corporation. It would cost billions, perhaps hundreds of billions, and take years of effort. But beyond economics lay deeper challenges. People had lived under very different systems for decades. In the East, the state had provided for basic needs, but demanded conformity and obedience. In the West, there was more freedom, but also more responsibility, more opportunity, but also more risk. Bringing these different worldviews together would require patience and understanding on both sides. Still, the work proceeded. Politicians negotiated, economists calculated, lawyers drafted agreements. The process was called 2+4, the two Germanys plus the 4 Allied powers that had occupied Germany after World War II. It was a delicate dance, requiring the consent not just of Germans, but of their neighbors who remembered the devastation of German aggression in 2 world wars. France and Britain, in particular, were nervous about reunification. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, privately expressed concerns about a reunited Germany becoming too powerful, too dominant in Europe. François Mitterrand of France shared similar worries. But the momentum was unstoppable, and ultimately, they gave their consent. The Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, also agreed, though extracting economic assistance as part of the deal. Soviet troops would withdraw from East Germany, ending the occupation that had begun in 1945. It was the end of an era, the final closing of a chapter that had begun with Hitler's defeat. In Berlin, the physical demolition of the wall continued. Professional demolition crews took over from the wall peckers, using heavy machinery to break down the barrier systematically. Section by section, the wall disappeared. Where once there had been concrete and barbed wire, now there were construction sites and gaps, passages opening where none had existed before. Some pieces of the wall were preserved as memorials. At Bernauer Strasse, a section was maintained as a historical site, complete with watchtower and death strip, a reminder of what had been. Other fragments were sold or given away, scattered around the world as souvenirs of a divided era. The demolition was both physical and symbolic. Each piece of wall that fell represented not just concrete being removed, but a psychological barrier being dismantled. People were learning to think of Berlin as one city again, not two halves awkwardly joined, but a single unified whole. Neighborhoods that had been cut in half were reconnecting. Streets that had ended at the wall now extended through to the other side. Public transportation lines were reestablished, trains running routes that hadn't existed for decades. The U-Bahn and S-Bahn, Berlin's subway and elevated rail systems, expanded back into the east, stitching the city together with threads of steel and electricity. But the human reconnections were more complicated than the infrastructure. Families that reunited discovered that they had become different people during their years of separation. Parents found that their adult children held different values, different worldviews. Brothers and sisters struggled to find common ground after decades of living under such different systems. There was a word that emerged to describe people from East Germany: Ossi. Similarly, West Germans were called Wessi. These terms were sometimes used affectionately, sometimes mockingly. They reflected real differences in experience, in attitude, in expectation. Ossis were seen as naive about capitalism, unsophisticated behind the times. Wesses were seen as arrogant, materialistic, insensitive to what Ossis had endured. Maria had grown up in East Berlin, worked as a teacher, raised 2 children alone after her husband's death. She had made her peace with the system, finding ways to live with integrity while avoiding political trouble. When the wall fell, she was excited but also frightened. At 53, she was being asked to start over, to learn new skills, to compete in a market economy she didn't understand. She attended training sessions on resume writing and job interviews, concepts that had been irrelevant in the East, where jobs were assigned rather than sought. She felt like a child again, uncertain and inadequate. Young people from the West ran the training sessions, speaking confidently about networking and personal branding, concepts that seemed foreign and slightly distasteful to her. "We had security," she told her daughter one evening. "We knew we would have work, have housing, have health care. It wasn't perfect, but we didn't have this constant anxiety about money and competition." Her daughter, who had embraced the changes with more enthusiasm, struggled to understand. "But you also had no freedom, no choice. Isn't this better, even if it's harder?" Maria didn't have an easy answer. Both things were true. She had lost security, but gained freedom. The trade seemed worth it in principle, but in practice, in the daily struggle to adapt and survive, it felt overwhelming. Many people from the East faced similar struggles. Factories closed as their outdated products couldn't compete with Western goods. Jobs disappeared. Savings held in worthless East German marks, evaporated. People who had felt competent and secure found themselves unemployed and struggling. The West German government had promised that reunification would not cost West Germans anything in taxes, that the East would be brought up to Western standards quickly and efficiently. Blooming landscapes, Chancellor Helmut Kohl had promised, but the reality proved far more costly and time-consuming than anticipated. Still, progress was visible. New buildings rose in the East. Infrastructure was upgraded. Telephone systems were modernized. Roads were repaved. The physical transformation of East Germany was dramatic and swift, even if the economic and social integration took longer. In October 1990, less than a year after the wall had opened, Germany officially reunified. October 3rd became a national holiday, the Day of German Unity. Flags waved, celebrations filled the streets. At midnight, the black, red, and gold flag of United Germany rose over the Reichstag building in Berlin. But even in celebration, there were notes of complexity. Some people in the East felt that reunification had been more like an annexation, a takeover by the West, rather than a true merging of equals. They felt their history was being dismissed, their experiences invalidated, their contributions forgotten. The East German mark ceased to exist, replaced by the West German Deutsche Mark. East German products disappeared from shelves, unable to compete with Western brands. Cultural institutions struggled as subsidies dried up. A whole way of life was vanishing, and while few wanted to return to the restrictions and surveillance of the old system, many mourned what was being lost. An older man named Werner had been a factory foreman in the East. He had taken pride in his work, in producing reliable, if not flashy, products. After reunification, the factory closed. The products were deemed unmarketable, the equipment obsolete. 40 years of my life, he said quietly to his wife. 40 years. And it's like it meant nothing. Like we produced garbage, like we were just wasting time. She held his hand, but had no words to comfort him. What could she say? That his work had mattered in its time and place? That history had simply moved on? The truth was his anger and grief were valid. An entire society's worth of effort and achievement was being dismissed, declared worthless by the verdict of the market. But alongside the losses, new opportunities emerged. Young people from the East could now travel freely, study abroad, pursue careers that had been closed to them before. They could speak their minds without fear, worship as they chose, make life decisions without state interference. These freedoms, abstract in description, were profound in experience. A young woman named Petra had dreamed of studying art in Paris, but had never been allowed to leave East Germany. 6 months after the wall fell, she was living in a cramped apartment near the Sorbonne, eating cheap bread and painting late into the night, happier than she had ever been. The security of her old life felt like a cage in retrospect. This struggle, this uncertainty, this freedom, this was living. Cultural exchange flowed both ways. West Germans discovered the Trabant, the humble East German car that became a symbol of nostalgia for the East. They found value in East German films and literature, in perspectives shaped by different experiences. Musicians from East and West collaborated, creating new sounds from the fusion of their different traditions. Berlin began to transform into something entirely new, neither purely Eastern nor Western, but something hybrid and unique. Artists and musicians, attracted by cheap rents in the former East, created a vibrant counterculture. Clubs opened in abandoned buildings, galleries in former factories. The city became a laboratory for reinvention, a place where anything seemed possible. The scars remained, of course. The death strip, that empty zone between the two walls, became a linear park in many places, a green space running through the city. But it remained a reminder, an absence that marked where the division had been. Memorials were erected to those who had died trying to cross the wall. Their names were read aloud at ceremonies. Their stories were told to school children. It was important not to forget, not to let the joy of reunification erase the pain of division. And slowly, year by year, the healing continued. Mixed marriages between Osses and Wesses became common. Children grew up in the reunited Germany, knowing the division only as history. The generation that had built and maintained the wall grew old and passed away. New leaders emerged who had never known a divided Germany. Let your breathing deepen now. Feel your body completely supported. The work of healing takes time, takes patience, takes willingness to accept complexity and difficulty. But it happens. Walls fall, divisions heal, new ways of being emerge from the ruins of the old. Rest in the knowledge that nothing is permanent, that change is constant, that even the deepest wounds can close with time and care. 20 years after the wall fell, Berlin held a celebration. 20 years, a nice round number, long enough to have perspective, but recent enough that many who had witnessed the fall were still there to remember. Artists created an installation where 1,000 painted domino tiles were set up along the path of the former wall. On the anniversary night, November 9th, 2009, they toppled the dominoes in a wave of falling pieces, a symbolic reenactment of the wall's collapse. People gathered to watch, to remember, to celebrate. There were those who had been children when the wall fell, now adults with children of their own. There were elderly people who had lived through the entire division, who could remember Berlin before the wall went up. And there were young people born after reunification, for whom the divided city was purely historical, as distant as World War II or the Weimar Republic. Anna, who had grown up in the shadow of the wall, brought her own daughter to the celebration. The girl was 7, the same age Anna had been when the wall opened. She asked questions her mother struggled to answer. Why did they build it, Mama? To keep people from leaving. The government thought if they built a wall, people would stay. But that's silly. Walls can't keep people where they don't want to be. And Anna smiled because her daughter was right. In the end, no wall is permanent. No barrier can indefinitely hold back people's desire for freedom and connection. The celebration was joyful, but also tinged with reflection. 20 years had brought tremendous change, but had not erased all divisions. East and West Germany were united legally, but economically and culturally, differences remained. Unemployment was still higher in the former East. Wages were lower. Many young people had left for opportunities in the West, leaving behind aging populations in hollowed-out cities. There was a phrase that circulated, "Die Mauer im Kopf," the wall in the head. The physical barrier was gone, but psychological divisions persisted. People still identified as Ossi or Wessi, still carried assumptions and prejudices about each other. But there was also undeniable progress. Berlin had become a vibrant, diverse, creative city. Young people from around the world flocked there, attracted by its energy and possibility. The scars of division had become part of its identity, contributing to its character rather than defining it. Klaus, the shopkeeper who had mourned his wife's grave, had passed away by then, but before he died, he had spent many years crossing freely to tend her resting place. He would bring fresh flowers, would sit and talk to her, would tell her about the changes in the city, about grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about a world she would barely have recognized. On his last visit, too weak to make the trip alone, his grandson had driven him. They sat together by the grave, 3 generations connected by memory and loss and love. "Tell me again," the grandson said, "what it was like when you couldn't visit." And Klaus told the story once more, his voice thin but steady. How he had stood by the wall every morning. How he had pressed his hand against the concrete. How he had never stopped believing that someday the barrier would fall. "Did you think you'd live to see it?" his grandson asked. Klaus smiled. "I didn't know, I hoped. But even if I hadn't, even if the wall had stood my entire life, I would have kept believing it could fall, because hope itself is a form of resistance." The lessons of the wall's fall echoed beyond Germany. Around the world, people drew inspiration from what had happened in Berlin. If such a seemingly permanent division could be overcome, what other barriers might fall? What other impossible changes might be achieved? In South Africa, where apartheid was finally ending, activists cited the Berlin Wall's fall as proof that unjust systems could be dismantled. In other divided places, Cyprus, Korea, Palestine, people pointed to Berlin as evidence that reunification was possible. But Berlin also offered cautionary lessons. Reunification was expensive, complicated, sometimes painful. Integration took decades, not months. Old wounds healed slowly, the romantic notion of barriers falling and everyone living happily ever after proved naive. Reality was messier, harder, more complex. Yet most people agreed it had been worth it. The difficulties of reunification, however real, were better than the cruelty of continued division. Families being together, however awkwardly, was better than being separated. Freedom, however challenging, was better than walls and wire and watchtowers. The stories were collected, preserved. Museums opened dedicated to the wall's history. The East Side Gallery preserved a long section of wall covered in murals, a permanent artwork memorial. School groups visited, learned the history, tried to understand what it had been like. Some feared the wall would be forgotten, that future generations would not grasp what it had meant. But others believed the memory would endure, passed down through stories and commemorations, through the physical remnants preserved as warnings and reminders. Maria, the teacher who had struggled with reunification, eventually adapted. She never became wealthy or entirely comfortable with market economics, but she found her place. She taught history now, telling students about life in East Germany. Not propaganda, not nostalgia, but honest memory. It wasn't all bad, she would tell them. We had community, solidarity. We looked out for each other. But we also had fear and limitation. We couldn't speak freely, travel freely, be fully ourselves. The wall outside reflected walls we carried inside. Her students, born after the fall, listened with the polite attention young people give to stories from a time they can barely imagine. Some were moved, others merely interested, still others vaguely bored. But the stories were told, the memories preserved, the lessons passed on. Stefan, the artist, continued creating. His work evolved, becoming less explicitly political, more personal and abstract. But the wall's influence remained visible in his art. The tension between division and unity, barrier and opening, separation and connection. One of his final pieces was installed where the wall had once stood. It was a series of glass panels, transparent, allowing people to see through to the other side. At certain times of day, when the sun hit just right, they cast colored shadows on the ground, reds and blues and golds, a rainbow bridge spanning the space where concrete had once stood. "The wall is gone," he said at the unveiling, "but we remember what it taught us. That division is easy, but unity is precious. That barriers can be built quickly, but take much longer to truly come down. That freedom must be actively maintained, not passively assumed." The world continued to change. The European Union expanded, eventually including several former Eastern Bloc countries. The euro replaced the Deutsche Mark. Berlin became the capital of reunited Germany, hosting the parliament in the restored Reichstag building. And still the wall remained in memory, in story, in the collective consciousness of a generation. Those who had lived through it carried it with them, a defining experience that shaped how they saw the world. Werner, the factory foreman whose work had been declared obsolete, found peace eventually. He volunteered at a memorial site, giving tours, sharing his experiences with visitors. He spoke honestly about the difficulty of reunification, about the losses and struggles. But he also spoke about freedom's value, about the joy of his grandchildren growing up in an undivided city. "I don't regret that it fell," he would tell tour groups. "How could I? But I won't pretend it was easy for everyone. Real change never is." As decades passed, the wall's fall became history in the fullest sense. Not lived experience, but learned knowledge, passed down through teaching and commemoration. The generation that remembered gave way to generations that only knew the stories. But the stories endured, the photographs and videos, the artifacts and memorials, the personal testimonies recorded and preserved. Future generations would know what had happened here, would understand that walls can fall when people refuse to accept them as permanent. And that lesson, that even the most solid-seeming barriers are temporary, that human connection will always find a way, that freedom and unity are worth struggling for, that lesson would echo forward through time, a gift from those who lived through history to those who would inherit it. Close your eyes now, breathe deeply and slowly. Feel gratitude for the freedoms you have, the connections you maintain, the absence of walls in your own life. Know that people struggled for these things, that what seems ordinary now was once impossible, that every peaceful sleep is a victory won by someone's courage and hope. Rest now in the knowledge that the world moves toward connection, that barriers are temporary, that morning always comes after night. In the quiet hours of night, when the world settles into stillness, we can reflect on what the Berlin Wall teaches us, not just as historical fact, but as human truth, as a story about what we do to each other and what we can overcome together. The wall stood for 28 years, 2 months, and 26 days. But it was more than concrete and wire. It was an idea, a belief that people could be permanently separated, that barriers could be absolute, that division could be made permanent. That idea was wrong. The people who lived beside the wall, who adapted to it and accepted it, never fully surrendered their desire for wholeness. Even those who defended the wall, who believed in the system it represented, carried within them the knowledge that something essential had been broken. A grandmother keeping a room ready for grandchildren she might never meet. A shopkeeper touching cold concrete every morning, maintaining connection with his wife across an impassable divide. A young girl sleeping beneath searchlight patterns, growing up in the shadow of division, but carrying within her the seed of hope. These small acts of resistance, of refusing to accept the wall as permanent, were as important as the political movements that eventually brought it down. Because walls fall not just through political action, but through the accumulated weight of human longing, the irresistible pull of connection that cannot be indefinitely denied. The night the wall opened, it happened because systems broke down, because communication failed, because one man made a decision in a moment of confusion and pressure. But really, it happened because millions of people had never stopped believing it could happen, never accepted that division was their permanent condition. Think about the walls in your own life, not concrete barriers, but the divisions we create and maintain, the distances we put between ourselves and others, the categories we use to separate people into us and them, the ways we build walls in our hearts and minds, barriers that keep out not just pain, but also possibility. The Berlin Wall teaches us that these divisions, however solid they seem, are not permanent. They are choices maintained daily by our actions and beliefs. And just as they can be built, they can be dismantled. It teaches us that reunification is possible, but not easy. That tearing down barriers is only the beginning. That the real work is learning to live together again, to bridge not just physical distances, but psychological ones. To see each other as fully human, despite our differences. It teaches us that change can come suddenly, dramatically, when conditions align, that decades of stasis can end in a single night, but also that lasting change requires sustained effort, patience, willingness to work through difficulties. The people of Berlin worked for decades to truly reunify their city. They struggled with economics and identity, with competing narratives and conflicting memories. They made mistakes, held on to prejudices, sometimes failed to understand each other. But they kept working at it, kept choosing unity over division, connection over separation. And gradually, year by year, the city healed. The wounds didn't disappear completely. Scars remained, and some always will. But they closed, became part of the city's identity rather than its defining characteristic. Berlin became not the divided city, but the city that had overcome division. This too is a lesson, that healing takes time, that we must be patient with ourselves and others as we navigate change, that perfection is not the goal, but rather progress, movement towards something better, even when that movement is slow and difficult. The wall also teaches us about the power of ordinary people. The Monday demonstrations in Leipzig weren't organized by politicians or military leaders, but by citizens with candles, singing hymns, refusing to be violent even when violence was expected. Harold Jaeger, the border guard who opened the checkpoint, was not a revolutionary, but a functionary overwhelmed by circumstances. Yet his decision changed history. Each person who chipped away at the wall, who helped a stranger across, who reached out to family on the other side, Each contributed to transforming the impossible into the real. We are not powerless. Systems that seem immovable can be moved. Barriers that seem permanent can fall. Not through one grand gesture, but through accumulated small acts of courage and hope. The wall teaches us to be suspicious of claims that division is necessary or inevitable. Those who built it said it was essential for peace and security. Those who maintained it claimed it protected people from danger. But these justifications disguise the real purpose: controlling people, limiting freedom, maintaining power through fear and separation. Whenever we encounter arguments for division, for building walls, literal or metaphorical, we should ask, who benefits from this barrier? Who is being controlled? What freedom is being limited? The answers are often revealing, but the wall also teaches us compassion for those who lived within unjust systems. The people of East Germany were not complicit villains, but ordinary humans trying to live decent lives under difficult circumstances. Many made compromises they wished they hadn't had to make. Many looked back with complicated feelings about their choices and experiences. We should judge them gently, understanding that we cannot know how we would have acted in their circumstances. The wall's legacy includes this lesson too: that moral clarity is easier in retrospect, that survival sometimes requires accommodation, that people can be both victims and participants in unjust systems. As you settle deeper into rest now, let these lessons wash over you like gentle waves. Feel the truth of them in your body, in the deep places where knowledge lives beyond words. Barriers fall, divisions heal, people find their way back to each other. These are not naive hopes, but historical facts, proven in Berlin and elsewhere. The work is hard and the path is long, but the destination, unity, freedom, connection, is worth the journey. In your own life, in your own way, you are part of this ongoing story. Every time you reach across a divide, every time you choose understanding over judgment, every time you refuse to accept that barriers are permanent, you participate in the same human project that brought down the Berlin Wall. The people of Berlin, in their patient decades of longing, in their sudden night of celebration, in their difficult years of reunification, they demonstrated something essential about human nature: that we are meant to be connected, not separated. That walls diminish us all, both those trapped behind them and those protected by them. That our true nature is to reach toward each other, to build bridges rather than barriers, to choose wholeness over division. Let this knowledge comfort you as you drift toward sleep. You are part of a species that tears down walls, that refuses to accept permanent separation, that always, eventually, finds its way toward connection and unity. The Berlin Wall stood for less than 3 decades, but has been gone for more than 3 now. Each year, its absence grows longer than its presence. Each year, more people live who never knew a divided Berlin. The wall's power fades with each passing year, becoming history rather than lived experience. But the lessons remain, the memory persists, and the truth it reveals about human nature and possibility continues to echo forward. A gift from those who lived through history to all who come after. Rest now, knowing that barriers are temporary, but human connection is eternal. That morning always comes after the longest night. That walls fall and families reunite and divided cities become whole again. The story of the Berlin Wall is ultimately a story of hope fulfilled, of patience rewarded, of the human spirit proving stronger than concrete and wire and fear. It is a story that continues every day in every place where people choose connection over division, understanding over prejudice, unity over separation. And it is a story that includes you in your own time and place, with your own choices and actions. Every barrier you refuse to build, every bridge you choose to cross, every wall you help dismantle, these are all part of the same eternal human project. Sleep now, peacefully, knowing that you are part of this great work, that even in rest, you carry forward the lessons learned in Berlin, that tomorrow you will wake to a world of possibility, where walls can fall and people can unite and hope can be fulfilled. The Berlin Wall is gone. The lessons remain. The hope endures. And in that hope, in that enduring possibility of change and connection and unity, we find peace. Rest now. Let go. Sleep.